is Palm Sunday. This is the start of a very important week in traditional Christianity, and even though unity has very little in common with traditional Christianity, I do think it's accurate to say that we're culturally Christian, and beyond that we're spiritually unlimited. Now that's something that I heard Reverend Tom Shepard say. He used to be the minister at Sunrise Unity here in Sacramento, and then was the professor of theology and history at Unity Institute before he retired here recently. Culturally Christian and spiritually unlimited, which means that we find meaning and value in the life and teachings of Jesus, but we don't stop there. In a similar way, there are many people who are culturally Jewish. They celebrate the high holidays, but they don't necessarily consider themselves to be the chosen people, or maintain a kosher diet, or observe all of the different rules and customs and beliefs of traditional Judaism. And that's perfectly fine. I think it's a basic human right to be able to do that. Just as people have a right to practice their religion, others have a right to practice no religion, or even cherry pick from different traditions if they choose. Things were much different back in the time of Jesus, because religion, culture, even ethnic identity were woven tightly together like a piece of fabric. To call yourself a Jew or an Israelite back in those days was to personally identify with the origin stories that they find in Genesis. You would trace your lineage proudly back to Moses, who led the people from Egypt and into the Promised Land. It was this story of divinely ordained freedom and triumph for the Jewish people, and not so good news for the people who already lived in the Promised Land, who were displaced or in some cases wiped out. So the story of Palm Sunday begins with an ironic twist, because on Palm Sunday the Jewish people were no longer the triumphant conquerors of the Promised Land. They were a conquered people themselves. On Palm Sunday, the mighty Roman Empire was in control of the Promised Land, and the once proud Jewish people were forced to pay tribute to Caesar. They lived under occupation of the Roman army. But the Jewish people still had hope. They had hope because their sacred scriptures contained prophecy which said that there was going to be a mighty hero, a savior, a Messiah, an anointed one who was going to deliver them from their enemies and make Israel into a superpower once again, just like back in the good old days, whenever those were. And there were a number of people who thought that Jesus might just be that hero. So on Palm Sunday, when he arrived in Jerusalem the week of Passover, he came there to celebrate Passover, they gave him a hero's welcome. That's what the stories tell us. They gave him a hero's welcome. He had spent the preceding months going around the countryside and talking about how the world was going to change. He was telling people about something that he called the kingdom of heaven, or sometimes you hear it called the kingdom of God. He talked about how the mighty were going to be brought low, the first will be last, the last will be first, and so on and so forth. And it was all supposed to happen during the lifetimes of the people that he was speaking to. It very clearly says that in 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the passage is translated like this. He would say, "I truly tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened." Well, that generation has most certainly passed away, and those things didn't happen, did they? In fact, things got worse, much worse. Not only did the kingdom of heaven not appear, the Jewish people lost their homeland, the Roman Empire destroyed Jerusalem, and the guy who said that that was going to happen was executed by the Romans, by the enemy, the occupying force. That's That's pretty bad news. And it's hard to imagine how Christianity managed to survive those events. Because Jesus appeared to be a false or failed prophet. But thanks to some very impressive legwork by Paul and quick thinking by the early church, Christianity not only survived, it thrived. And the real irony is that it was the Roman Empire that carried it out to the ends of the earth. Think about that. The same Roman Empire that executed Jesus became the vehicle used by his followers to spread the new religion. And if someone had written this as a screenplay and shopped it around Hollywood for a buyer, they would have been told it's too far-fetched. Nobody would believe it. And fact is often stranger than fiction, which is why I think history is fascinating. And history repeats itself. Just to show how strange it can be, think about what happened to Christianity after it won over the Roman Empire. This is the same Roman Empire that had been the oppressor, the persecutor. The same Roman Empire that had persecuted and oppressed the Israelites, had persecuted and killed the early Christians. Well, Christianity became an empire itself. Institutionalized Christianity goes on a campaign of oppression, persecution, crusades, conquest, and anyone who challenged their authority, they were branded as heretics. And when that happened, you get burned at the stake, or worse, if there is such a thing. And before that, we had the oppressed and enslaved Israelites who escaped their oppressors in Egypt and proceeded to displace the people in the Promised Land. And it's like this vicious circle. It's this cycle of oppression, liberation, and oppression again that's been going on for over 5,000 years all around the world, not just in Palestine. I'm not just singling out Israel and the early Christian church here. It's all around the world. People are oppressed, they're persecuted, they escape their oppressor, and then they become the oppressor. It's kind of depressing. Yeah. I mean, I would hate to think that it's an unavoidable part of the human condition, but isn't that the way it appears? Well, back in 1992, a theologian named Walter Wink wrote a book called Engaging the Powers. The subtitle of the book is Discernment and Resistance in a World of Domination. Discernment and Resistance in a World of Domination. I've been working with his ideas since I first got involved in this line of work, and this is just one of 3 rather long books that he wrote on the subject. You know, one of the problems with theologians is that they usually write for an academic audience, graduate school people, and they'll sometimes end up complicating things beyond comprehension. Well, not Walter Wink. For a theologian, he writes with remarkable clarity. Still a bit dense, but I think his ideas are accessible to more people. So Walter Wink in this book, he sees Jesus as a spiritual leader who tried to break that vicious cycle of persecution, liberation, and conquest that I was just talking about. Jesus may have been wrong about the time frame and the precise sequence of events, but there were some important things that he got right that we still need to look at and listen to. One of the things he got right was the need to confront the oppressor, to stand up to a misuse or abuse of power. That's exactly what he was doing when he traveled to Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. He makes his triumphal entry into the city, and then the very next day, he heads over to the temple where he makes this big scene, throwing the merchants and the moneylenders out of the temple in front of hundreds of onlookers. It was a demonstration. It was a message, and the message was, do not let money and materialism corrupt the temple or your culture. See, Jesus had identified a big part of the reason why this cycle of oppression and liberation keeps repeating itself in human history. It's because people have been fooled into believing crazy ideas. Crazy ideas like money and property is more important than spiritual things. That's just one of them, but he really zeroed in on that one. People believe crazy ideas, and those crazy ideas are what have the corrupting influence. Professor Wink calls an oppressive military empire like Rome, he calls them a domination system. But they don't just dominate you physically, they get inside your head. They get inside your head with a whole bunch of crazy ideas, which Professor Wink, in his lovely academic language, calls delusional assumptions. Crazy ideas, delusional assumptions, basically the same thing. That's the way they maintain control. Force is a part of it, but the war of ideas is even more important. Jesus was attacking delusional assumptions. Here's how Walter Wink describes them in the book. He says, people would not be so acquiescent in their own oppression unless they were caught in a powerful delusion. Delude is from the Latin deludere, to play, to defraud, to befool the mind of judgment so as to cause what is false to be accepted as true. That's why we call ourselves truth students. Now, this concept of crazy ideas, delusional assumptions, it's not unique to Jesus. It's not unique to Walter Wink either. We just got done working with the ideas of the Buddha. This should be sounding familiar to you because the Buddha was dealing with delusional assumptions in his part of the world. Not the same way that Jesus was, of course, but the Buddha's entire message was centered around stepping out of our delusional way of seeing the world and ourselves. In other words, liberation from suffering caused by delusion. You hear that over and over again in Buddhist teachings. Another place that we see this idea is in a little book that's become very popular in unity circles over the years called The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. He doesn't use the term delusional assumptions, though. He calls it domestication. Anyone read the book? He calls it domestication. It's the way we allow ourselves to be programmed because we want to please people in authority, starting with our parents, of course. We want to please the people around us. We want to please our tribe. We want to let them know that we belong to this tribe, so we profess to believe crazy things sometimes just to belong to a family or a tribe. We need to see those things. We need to question those things. Here's what Don Miguel says about it. At an early age, we learn punishment and reward and form an image of perfection in order to try to be good enough to get the reward. We live by an image of how we should be in order to be accepted by everybody else, and our fear of being rejected becomes the fear of not being good enough. It's a good way of putting it. Now what happens is that people observe human behavior. They see this tendency that we have towards domestication, delusional assumptions, crazy ideas, and they learn how to take advantage of that. They do it for their own purposes. Don Miguel says that in many cases we willingly buy into the delusion, but there is an element of deception that's involved. Professor Wink talked about how we are befooled into these delusional assumptions. The one I like best, though, comes from another one of my favorites, the late, great Carl Sagan. He called it the bamboozle. The bamboozle. This is from his 1995 book. It's called The Demon Haunted World. Science is a Candle in the Dark. Here's what he says. One of the saddest lessons of history is this. If we've been bamboozled long enough, we tend to reject any evidence of the bamboozle. We're no longer interested in finding out the truth. The bamboozle has captured us. It's simply too painful to acknowledge, even to ourselves, that we've been taken. Once you give a charlatan power over you, you almost never get it back. Carl Sagan. Advertising, religion, politics, they can all work that way because if people buy into the delusional assumptions, they're much easier to control. Yeah, you can use force, but that gets messy and inefficient. But if you get a hold of people's minds, they're much easier to control. And the problem then is that even when the oppressed people escape the physical domination, they're still carriers of the delusional assumptions. The crazy ideas, they're like a virus. They infect us, we're not necessarily aware of it, and is it no wonder that the cycle continues and goes round and round like that? The oppressed become the next domination system because they still operate based on the delusional assumptions. They're still infected. Jesus, like the Buddha, thought that this cycle could be stopped, that liberation was possible, and it was a message that he was willing to die for. He had a pretty good idea what was awaiting him in Jerusalem when he arrived there on Palm Sunday. The metaphor that Jesus used for this liberation, as I mentioned earlier, was the kingdom of heaven. Actually, Jesus probably didn't think of it, though, as a metaphor because there's evidence that he really believed that God was going to intervene and give us some help in sorting things out, so to speak. The Romans, they weren't just going to lay down their weapons and cooperate. It was going to take some supernatural persuasion. And like I said earlier, there were some things that Jesus got wrong, but this is what we can take away. You see, even though he thought he was going to get some divine assistance in setting things up, he always made it clear that people would still have to change the way they were thinking and the way they were believing if they wanted to be a part of this coming kingdom of heaven on earth. People were going to have to change. We see that reflected, I think, most clearly in the words of Paul. He understood what had to happen when he said this in his letter to the Romans. He said, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds." Don't conform to the delusional assumptions. Domestication, the bamboozle. Don't conform to those things. Change the way you think. Change the way you act. Challenge the so-called popular wisdom of the surrounding culture. It's not an easy thing to do. If we've been bamboozled long enough, we tend to reject any evidence of the bamboozle. We lose interest in finding the truth because the delusion is so comfortable, so familiar. So Jesus, through the words of Paul, calls us to be transformed. We all love transformation, right? Every time I get a flyer for a workshop, especially in Unity and New Age circles, everybody talks about transformation. Oh, we're going to transform this and transform that. Everybody wants to be transformed, but nobody wants to change. That's the thing, ain't it the truth? We want that transformation, but don't make me challenge my worldview. Don't make me even examine my worldview. Just make me comfortable in the way things are right now, and I'll consider it transformation if I'm a little bit happier for a few days. Who cares when I go back to work on Monday that I'm the same old whatever? That's the way it goes. So we're coming up on Easter, okay? And if Easter is about anything, it's about radical transformation. That's what we're talking about here. A form of liberation that can be experienced as a kind of resurrection. But first, we have to be willing to identify and confront the delusional assumptions, the bamboozle. And we will start that process next week on Easter Sunday. See you then. Thank you.